The blade was already at her throat when Adeline Arden decided she was done being afraid. She stood in the center of the obsidian court, the most ancient gathering of vampire nobility in existence, hidden 5 stories beneath the streets of Vienna in a cathedral carved from black stone and old ambition. 300 immortal eyes watched her with the particular brand of contempt that only creatures who had outlived empires could manufacture. She was human, she was mortal. She was the sole surviving heiress of the Arden bloodline, a family that had brokered peace between the human and vampire worlds for 6 generations, and she was, by every visible measure, completely alone. The vampire pressing the ceremonial blade against her pulse point was named Seraphian Voss, and he was beautiful the way a glacier was beautiful, cold and vast and utterly indifferent to the things it destroyed. His white hair fell in perfect waves past sharp cheekbones, and his pale eyes held the absolute certainty of a man who had never once been told no in 4 centuries of existing. "The blood law is clear," Seraphian announced to the assembled court, his voice carrying the practiced resonance of a man who enjoyed the sound of it. "The Arden Compact requires a blood heir to renew it each generation. The girl's father is dead. Her mother is dead. She stands here alone, unbound, unspoken, for with no immortal patron to guarantee her standing in this court." He paused, letting the silence do its work. "Under ancient statute, an unclaimed human in the obsidian court may be challenged, claimed, or removed. I choose removal." The murmuring that moved through the assembled nobles was not protest. It was agreement. Adeline felt the cold edge of the blade and did not flinch. She had been preparing for this moment for 8 months, since the night she had found her father's journals hidden behind the false wall of his study, and understood, for the first time, exactly what world she had been born into. Every negotiation her family had ever brokered, every treaty, every dangerous concession. Every time a human diplomat had entered a room full of immortals and survived by nothing more than reputation and nerve. She was her father's daughter. "I invoke the right of declaration," she said clearly. The silence that followed was of an entirely different quality. Seraphian's eyes narrowed. Across the vast obsidian chamber, she heard the rustle of 300 immortals shifting in their ancient seats. Something she had been told was the equivalent of a collective gasp in a room where no one needed to breathe. "You cannot invoke what you do not understand," Seraphian said, but there was something new in his voice now, a hairline fracture in the certainty. "The right of declaration," Adeline continued, because her voice was steady, and she was going to keep it that way if it killed her, "is outlined in the 7th Covenant of the Dragomir Accords, ratified in 1683, which predates every statute you just cited by 4 decades. It states that any mortal of recognized compact lineage who enters this court may declare themselves under the direct protection of the reigning sovereign, bypassing all challenge claims until a formal hearing can be convened." She tilted her head slightly against the blade, just enough to look past Seraphian to the raised dais at the far end of the chamber. "And I believe the reigning sovereign is present." Every head in the room turned. He had been standing in the shadows of the dais, so completely and deliberately still that the eye simply slid past him, which she had suspected was intentional. Now he stepped forward, and the entire character of the room changed the way a room changes when lightning strikes close by. The assembled court went rigid with something between reverence and primal fear. Marius Dragomir was not what Adeline had expected. Despite everything she had read, despite her father's careful descriptions in those hidden journals, despite the portraits that hung in the archive rooms she had accessed in the 8 months since her father's death. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a black suit that managed to look both brutally modern and like something that had been worn by kings for centuries. His skin was the pale of marble in winter light. His hair was the white of fresh snow and fell in severe lines that framed a face that was genuinely, dangerously beautiful in the way old weapons were beautiful, made with absolute purpose and no wasted motion. His eyes, when they found hers across the vast chamber, were a deep, unsettling silver, the color of a winter sky right before everything went still. He looked at Seraphian and said nothing. Seraphian removed the blade. The speed with which it happened would have been humiliating if Seraphian had possessed the capacity for humiliation. Instead, he stepped back with the precise, calculated grace of a man who was absolutely furious and absolutely aware that he could not show it. "The right of declaration is invoked," Marius said, and his voice was low and carrying, and somehow managed to fill every corner of the cathedral chamber without effort. "Adeline Arden is under sovereign protection. Any challenge to her standing will be answered by me personally." The silver eyes swept the room with the slow completeness of a man taking inventory of threats. That will be all. The court dissolved. Not quickly, not with panic, but with the controlled, dignified speed of people who understood they were being dismissed and chose to frame it as their own decision. Within 4 minutes, the obsidian court was empty except for Seraphian, who lingered a moment too long with something unreadable in his pale eyes before he, too, swept out through the carved obsidian doors. Adeline stood in the suddenly empty chamber, the blade no longer at her throat, and let herself breathe for the first time in what felt like an hour. Marius descended from the dais. He moved the way she imagined all truly powerful things moved, without hurry, without hesitation, as though the space around him existed by his permission rather than his navigation. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up, and studied her face with an expression she could not immediately categorize. "You invoked a covenant that has not been used in 200 years, he said. "My father documented every provision of every accord your family has ever ratified," she said. "I have been reading for 8 months. Something shifted in his silver eyes. Not softness exactly, but its possibility. "Your father," he said carefully, "was the finest human diplomat this court has ever seen." "I know," she said. "I plan to do better." The silence between them had weight and texture, and she did not look away from it. "You realize," Marius said, and now there was something else in his voice, something quieter and more precise than his public authority, that by invoking sovereign protection, you have made yourself my responsibility. In the eyes of this court, in the law of the accords, until that hearing is convened, your safety, your standing, your every action here reflects on me personally. "I'm aware," she said, "and you are not concerned by that. I'm more concerned by what Seraphian Voss was doing with a ceremonial blade at my throat. 40 seconds after I walked through the door, which suggests his plan to remove me, was already in motion before I even entered this chamber, which means I have a leak somewhere in my own legal team and a vampire lord who wants the Arden Compact dissolved badly enough to commit a capital offense in front of 300 witnesses." She held his gaze. "I'm concerned by the right things, my lord." Marius Dragomir looked at her for a long moment with those impossible silver eyes, and for the first time since she had walked into the most dangerous room she had ever entered, Adeline had the distinct impression that she was being seen rather than assessed. "Come," he said. We need to talk somewhere that does not have an audience. The private halls of the Obsidian Court were a different world from the cathedral chamber, where the court was designed to impress, to intimidate, to remind every visitor of the antiquity and scale of vampire civilization. The sovereign's private wing was spare and oddly human in its proportions. The walls were lined with books, actual books, thousands of them, shelved with the casual accumulation of a person who had been reading for centuries because they genuinely loved it. The lights were warm rather than architectural. There was a desk that was buried under documents, and what appeared to be 3 half-finished translations of very old texts. Adeline stopped in the doorway and looked at the desk and the books and the handwritten notes pinned in clusters on a board beside the window, and for the first time since entering the underground cathedral, she felt something loosen in her chest. Her father had kept a study that looked almost exactly like this. "You can sit," Marius said from behind her, and the dryness of it surprised her into almost smiling. She sat. He remained standing for a moment, then pulled a second chair to the opposite side of the desk with the ease of someone who had no intention of using furniture as a power statement, which she noted. He sat, rested his elbows on the desk, and looked at her with the focused attention of someone who actually intended to listen. "Tell me about the leak," he said. She told him. All of it. From the night she had found her father's journals, through the 8 months of preparation, the legal team she had assembled, the coded request for a formal hearing she had filed with the court registry 3 months ago, and the cold certainty she had felt, standing outside the obsidian doors tonight, knowing that Sephian Voss had been informed of the exact terms of her filing in a way that was only possible if someone inside her circle had shared the documents. Marius listened without interrupting. This alone was striking. In her experience, recent powerful men interrupted. They constructed their responses while she was still talking. He did not. He listened with a complete attention that she found slightly unnerving, as though every word she said was being precisely catalogued and would be retrieved without distortion later. "Seraphian wants the Arden Compact dissolved," Marius said when she finished. "He has wanted it dissolved for 40 years. The compact limits his ability to operate in 12 territories where the Arden family has historically mediated jurisdiction disputes. Without it, he could consolidate power in those territories within a decade. What does he get from those territories? Commerce, influence routes. 3 of them sit on the lines that haven't been officially mapped by any court registry." He paused. "Your father knew this. I believe part of why he maintained the compact so rigorously, despite considerable pressure, was precisely because he understood what dissolving it would mean." Adeline looked at him. "You knew my father for 30 years. The silver eyes were steady and, she thought, genuinely sad, in the careful way of someone who had learned to carry grief without letting it show much. He was, as I said, the finest diplomat this court has produced. I was enormously sorry to lose him. He died in a car accident," she said, and let the sentence sit there. Something in Marius's face went very still. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything yet. I'm telling you what I know, which is that my father drove that road twice a week for 15 years without incident, and that 3 days before he died, he wrote in his journal that he had uncovered something about the ley line territories and was planning to bring it formally to your attention." She held his gaze. "I brought it to your attention instead." The silence in the study was the kind that happens when something important has just been named for the first time. "I want to see that journal," Marius said. "I thought you might," she said, and reached into the interior pocket of her coat. She had copied the relevant pages. Of course she had. She was not going to carry the only copy of a murdered man's evidence into a room full of people who wanted it destroyed. The copies were printed on plain paper with no identifying marks, and she slid them across the desk to him now and watched his face as he read. Whatever emotion moved through him, he contained it, but she saw the slight tightening at the corners of those silver eyes, the fraction of tension that entered the line of his jaw, the way his hands went very still on the pages. When he finished, he looked up. 3 nights ago, he said, Seraphian Voss formally proposed before the Inner Council that the Arden Compact be dissolved in absentia, on the grounds that your father's death terminated the lineage's ability to fulfill its obligations. I voted against it. So did 2 other council members. He needed 1 more vote, and he did not have it. His voice was level. Tonight was a contingency plan. Remove me before the hearing, Adeline said. No heir, no compact, no vote needed. Yes. He stood and moved to the window. An old habit, she thought. The kind of thing a person did when they needed a moment, to think without an audience, even if the window looked out on nothing but stone and underground dark. He will try again. Tonight's failure only clarifies his method. He will not make the same mistakes twice in open court. Then we need to be faster than him. Marius turned from the window and looked at her with something that was starting to become recognizable. Not admiration exactly. It was too early and too careful for that. But the beginning of it, the precursor, the moment when respect stops being a decision and starts being a response. The hearing is in 10 days, he said. Until then, you are under sovereign protection, which means you will need to remain in close proximity to this court. It also means Seraphian cannot touch you in open challenge. He paused. It does not mean he cannot try other methods. I know, she said. I'll need access to the court archives, specifically everything relating to the leyline territories and any financial instruments connected to them in the last 20 years. You'll have it, he said. Without hesitation, she blinked. She had been prepared to argue for that access. She had prepared 3 separate supporting arguments and a citation from the Dragomir Accords that would have compelled him to grant it, even if he'd been unwilling. His immediate agreement disarmed her more thoroughly than any opposition would have. You're surprised, he said. I prepared arguments. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but what a smile had been assembled from. You can still use them if you prefer. And there it was, that small, unexpected warmth in the middle of all the danger, and Adeline Arden felt something shift inside her that she had not been expecting, and was not entirely sure she was ready for. She spent the next 3 days in the archives. The court archivists, 4 ancient vampires, who had been cataloguing knowledge since before the printing press, regarded her initial arrival with the specific variety of hostility reserved for those who threatened institutional order. She was human. She was mortal. She made noise when she moved and generated warmth when she sat still, and occasionally she had to eat, which required leaving the archive and returning, which interrupted the silence. By the end of the first day, she had reorganized 6 decades of unsorted financial records into a cross-referenced system that even the eldest archivist admitted was considerably more functional than the previous arrangement. By the end of the second day, they were bringing her things without being asked. She found the first thread on the afternoon of day 3, buried inside a subsidiary accounting ledger from 1987 that related to a shell corporation with an address in Luxembourg and a board of directors that, when traced through 3 layers of holding companies, resolved to a single named individual who appeared in no fewer than 47 other instruments across the 6 territories she had been examining. The name was not Seraphian Voss. It was a human name, a name she recognized. Her stomach went cold. She brought the ledger to Marius that evening. In the 3 days since the night in the Obsidian Court, she had seen him briefly in passing and twice at meals that were technically social obligations of sovereign hospitality, but which had both times extended considerably beyond their scheduled duration because they kept talking. He was, she had discovered, deeply and genuinely interested in the same subjects she was: history, law, the mechanics of political structure, the long game of diplomacy. He had opinions that were pointed and specific and sometimes wrong, and when she told him so, he did not immediately become defensive. He asked her to explain her position, and when her explanation was sound, he said so and revised his view, and she found this more attractive than she was entirely comfortable with. He was also, she had to admit, the most physically beautiful person she had ever been in a room with, which was not an uncomplicated observation given who and what he was, but honesty was her family's oldest tradition, and she was not going to start lying to herself now. She found him in his study with 2 other council members she had been introduced to as Valdris Nighthollow and Cressida Morn, both ancient, both powerful, both watching her with the calculating alertness of people who were still deciding what she was. She spread the ledger on the desk and pointed to the name. The silence that fell was of the variety that occurs when a bomb goes off somewhere far enough away that the sound arrives a moment after the shock wave. "Harlan Ames," Marius said. "My father's legal representative," Adeline said, "the man who handled all his court filings, the man who assembled my legal team, the man who filed my hearing request 3 months ago." She kept her voice level. "The leak was not inside my team. The leak was the person I trusted to build my team." Valdris Nighthollow, who had silver hair wound back in a severe knot and the cold eyes of a strategist, leaned over the ledger. "This document establishes financial connection to Seraphian's holdings as far back as 35 years. If your father's legal filings were all routed through Ames, then Seraphian knew every move my father was planning to make, every diplomatic position, every piece of evidence he was assembling about the ley line territories." Adeline heard the thing in her own voice that she did not want to hear and could not entirely prevent: the grief in it, the fury, the way they had both been used. He was not just a leak, he was a long-term placement. Seraphian built an informant into the Arden legal infrastructure decades ago, which means my father's accident was not an accident, Marius said, and his voice had gone very quiet in the specific way that quiet meant danger. Cressida Morn, who was small and dark-eyed and moved with the compressed energy of something that's had survived a very long time by being underestimated, looked at Adeline with an expression that had shifted, finally, into something like assessment. "She found this in 3 days, she said to Marius. "Yes," he said. "Seraphian had 35 years, and he did not find it. My father did," Adeline said, 3 days before he died. She looked at Marius. "Seraphian knew he'd found it. That's what the journal entry was. That's what the accident was. He killed my father to stop him from bringing this to you." The room was very still. Marius stood, and when he spoke, his voice carried the absolute authority of a sovereign who had decided. "I want court investigators on Harlan Ames within the hour, full surveillance. Nothing moves through his office until I say otherwise. He looked at Valdris. I want Seraphian's financial instruments reviewed against this ledger. Full audit court authority. He looked at Cressida. I want the ley line territories placed under formal court review, pending the hearing. No territory transfers, no new instruments, nothing. He turned last to Adeline. And I want you moved to secured quarters tonight. I'm fine in the guest wing, she said. You found the evidence that implicates Seraphian in a murder committed against a court-recognized diplomat. You are no longer in the category of a protected hearing party. You are a witness. His silver eyes were absolutely steady. I am not negotiating this one. She looked at him for a moment. All right, she said. Something in his face changed when she agreed without further argument, something that looked startlingly like relief. The secured quarters were on the same floor as his private study, which she suspected was not an accident. They were also considerably larger and better furnished than the guest wing, with walls of books and windows that looked out over a deep underground garden that someone had grown entirely under artificial light, violets and white roses, and something dark-leafed she could not identify. She stood at the window for a long time that first night, and thought about her father, and about evidence, and about a beautiful, dangerous sovereign who had voted against dissolving her family's compact before he had ever met her, and she felt the grief and the anger, and beneath both of them, something complicated and warm that she was not ready to name yet, but could no longer pretend was not there. She was woken at 3 a.m. by a sound that was wrong, not loud, not violent, just wrong. The specific quality of a silence that has replaced something that should still be present. She was out of bed and at the door in 4 seconds, which she credited to 3 years of self-defense training she had begun at 21, after reading her father's first journal and understanding for the first time what world she moved in. The guard who had been stationed outside her door was gone, not attacked. No sign of struggle, no smell of blood, simply gone, which was in some ways worse. She moved down the corridor with her back against the wall and her phone already in hand. A very specific phone that her father had given her 5 years ago, with a single contact programmed under a name that was not a name but a frequency. Something he had told her to use, only if she was certain she was in danger inside a court building and all other options were unavailable. She was certain. She pressed the contact. The hall called to her right at the same moment, a door that should have been locked, swinging open to admit 3 figures in dark clothing who moved with the controlled silence of professional intent. They were not vampires. They were human, which was in some ways more frightening because it meant Seraphian had planned specifically for a scenario where vampire speed would be conspicuous. She ran. She was fast. She had been training for this world for 3 years, and she was fast, and she knew the layout of this floor, because she had spent 2 evenings memorizing it, the way she memorized everything, systematically and thoroughly. She got 3 corridors ahead of them, and then a hand came out of a doorway. She had not anticipated being occupied and caught her arm, and she was already twisting into the defensive move before she heard his voice. "It is me," Marius said. She stopped fighting. Her heart was doing something violent in her chest, but her hands were steady, and she registered this as a small personal victory. He looked at her for 1 fractured second, with an expression she had not seen on his face before, raw and uncontrolled and briefly transparent, something that looked like terror at finding her still upright and unharmed. Then it was gone, replaced by the composed authority she had come to recognize as his public face. 3 professionals, she said quietly. Human, southeast corridor, he said. I counted 4. 4. Come. They moved through a passage she had not found on her floor plan, a narrow servants'-era corridor that ran parallel to the main hall, and she was aware of him close behind her, his hand at her shoulder, not directing her, just there, a presence that was catastrophically reassuring given the circumstances. The passage opened into his study, and he sealed the door behind them with the kind of decisive physical authority that told her the mechanism locking. It was not a modern electronic, but something considerably older and more final. Your guard was bribed, he said. Taken off station with a manufactured emergency. Seraphian is escalating. He's afraid, Adeline said. The audit evidence is enough to bring formal charges. The hearing is 7 days away, and he knows we can present this. She looked at Marius. He's not trying to dissolve the compact anymore. He's trying to prevent me from giving testimony. Marius looked at her in the warm light of his study, and she watched something move through his silver eyes, something he was not entirely managing to contain. I underestimated the speed of his response, he said, and the admission was precise and clearly not easy. I should not have. You had investigators and an audit and a territory review all moving simultaneously. He felt the net tightening. That is not an excuse for failing to adequately protect you. The word failing sat strangely in the air between them, carrying a weight that was not purely strategic. I'm not hurt, she said quietly. You could have been. His voice had lost its public precision. It was lower now, more direct, stripped of its formal architecture. Adeline, you could have been. Her name in his mouth was different from how anyone else said it. She did not examine why. Not right now. What happens next? She said instead. You do not leave this study until morning. I will manage the breach personally. His eyes held hers, and I will not make the same error again. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the armchair beside the bookshelves, with one of his books open on her lap, and read 3 pages she could not have summarized afterward, and he sat at his desk and worked, occasionally asking her questions about the documents she had found, and they talked until grey light began to filter through the artificial skylight he had installed above the underground garden, and it was the most achingly ordinary and simultaneously extraordinary night of her life. At some point near dawn, she looked up from the unread book and found him watching her with the silver eyes that had stopped trying to be unreadable. My father wrote about you, she said, because she had been thinking about this for days and had not found a better way to say it. Not just in professional terms. He said, you were the most honorable sovereign this court had ever produced, and that his greatest hope was that you would find someone worthy of you. Marius was very still. He also said, she continued, that the thing most likely to destroy you was that you held yourself to a standard no one around you could meet, and that you had been alone for a very long time. The silence was complete. He knew you better than most, Marius said finally. He did, she said. I think he knew me better than most too. She held his gaze. I think he knew where I would end up. The sentence was carrying more weight than its surface, and she knew it, and she could see that he knew it too, and for a long moment neither of them moved, and then the morning monitoring system in the corner of his desk chimed with an alert, and the moment shifted into its next form, and they both let it, because some things needed more time before they could be handled. 4 days before the hearing, Harlan Ames attempted to flee Vienna. He made it as far as the airport. The court investigators were already there. He He was brought back to the underground court in the company of two of Marius's most senior enforcers, pale and visibly shaken, and in possession of a secured briefcase that, when opened under court authority, contained documents that made the Luxembourg ledger look modest. Full communications between aims and a chain of intermediaries that traced directly and without interruption to Seraphian Voss. Payment records covering 37 years, and a series of documents that were not financial at all. They were operational, specific instructions and responses relating to the monitoring and disruption of Adeline's father's activities in the final year of his life, culminating in a set of communications dated 48 hours before his car accident. Adeline sat in the formal evidence review and read every page. Marius sat beside her, not at the end of the table in the sovereign's seat. Beside her, their arms almost touching. And when she reached the final document and went very still in the way that meant she was holding something together that did not want to stay held, she felt his hand settle over hers on the table, warm and certain and completely unambiguous, and she turned her hand over and held on. Nobody in the room commented on this. Everyone in the room noticed. She spent that evening alone in the underground garden, sitting on the stone bench among the white roses, and she cried for the first time since her father's death. Not the controlled grief she had been managing for 8 months, but the real thing, deep and formless and necessary. She was alone for about 12 minutes before she heard footsteps on the garden path, and she did not have to look up to know who it was. Marius sat beside her on the bench and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. He was close enough that his shoulder pressed against hers, solid and present, and she leaned into it just slightly, and he remained perfectly still in the way of a person who had no intention of moving for any reason. He spent 30 years protecting this court's relationship with the human world, she said. He believed in it, he believed in the possibility of it, and he was killed for it. Yes, Marius said. He did not soften this. He was right to believe in it. She turned her head to look at him. The underground garden lights caught the white of his hair, the silver of his eyes, the precise architecture of a face that was starting to feel, impossibly, like something she recognized. Tell me, he was right. He was right, Marius said, and the way he said it made the words carry far more than the sentence contained. She held his gaze, this close, in the garden quiet. Without the formal architecture of court politics surrounding them, he looked less like a sovereign and more like a person, which she had suspected all along, but which the evidence was becoming difficult to manage. I want to win this hearing, she said, not just for the compact, not just for my father. I want to win it because the world he believed in is worth fighting for. The kind of world where humans and vampires don't have to be afraid of each other. Then we will win it, he said. I have never wanted anything this court could offer that I was willing to fight for the way I am willing to fight for this. A pause, precise and deliberate. For you. The garden was very quiet around them. Marius, she said softly. I know, he said. I am aware of every objection. I have catalogued them in considerable detail over the last several days. The difference in what we are, what our lives are structured to be, the political complexity, the fact that you came here to fight a legal battle and not to... He stopped, started again. I have never been careless with something I could not afford to lose. And what is it you are afraid of losing? She asked. He looked at her for a long time with those extraordinary silver eyes, and she saw in them something she had never expected to find in the sovereign of the oldest vampire court in the world, vulnerability that was genuine and unmanaged and entirely without performance. "You," he said, "before I have properly had the chance to have you." She kissed him. She was not entirely sure in the aftermath which of them had moved first. She thought it might have been her, and she found she was not sorry about it. His hand came up to her face, careful and certain, and the kiss was not tentative or exploratory. It was the kiss of two people who had been arriving at this point through 8 months of dead man's journals, and 3 days of archives and a midnight corridor and a garden and a long accumulation of evidence that now felt, in retrospect, entirely obvious. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers, and she felt his breath, unnecessary but warm against her skin. "The hearing is in 4 days, she said. "I know. We need to be focused. I am extraordinarily focused," he said dryly, and she laughed, which she had not done in 8 months, and the sound of it seemed to do something specific and permanent to his expression that she filed away for later consideration. The 3 days before the hearing were extraordinary in the particular way that days become extraordinary when the stakes are absolute and the company is right. They worked. They worked with a shared precision and complementary rhythm that Adeline would have found professionally satisfying, even if she had not been falling in love with her co-architect. She who understood human law and her father's documentation of 30 years of compact negotiations, and he who understood vampire court politics and the specific pressure points in Seraphian's alliances, and the exact legal architecture of the Dragomir Accords that could be used to dismantle what Seraphian had built. They built a case together that was, she genuinely believed, airtight. Seraphian tried twice more to interrupt the process. The first time, he sent an emissary to the hearing registry, attempting to file a procedural objection that would have delayed the hearing by 60 days. Adeline had anticipated this and had a preemptive counterfiling already registered that blocked it on 3 separate grounds. The registry official, a meticulous ancient vampire named Orthrin Pale, looked at her counterfiling and then looked at her with the particular expression of someone revising a position they had held for a long time. The second time, Seraphian approached Valdris Nighthollow directly with what amounted to a bribe, dressed in the language of political alliance. Valdris, who had spent 3 evenings watching Adeline work in the archives and had made his own private assessment, declined in terms that were precise enough to be preserved in the court record. The night before the hearing, Marius found her awake in the garden at midnight, which had become, without either of them formally deciding it, a place that was theirs. "How are you?" he asked. "Ready," she said, which was entirely true and not the complete answer. He sat beside her. She leaned into him in the comfortable and specific way that had already become a habit, her shoulder against his arm around her in a curve that said certainty, not possession. The difference mattered enormously to her, and he had understood it without being told. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "I want you to know that regardless of the outcome, you have already done more than anyone expected of you. You came here alone, to a world that did not believe you could survive it, and you found evidence that has destabilized a 35-year conspiracy. Your father would have been—" "Do not," she said quietly. "Not tonight. I cannot hold my father's pride and my own composure at the same time right now." He was quiet for a moment. "Then let me say only what is mine to say." His arm tightened slightly around her. "You are the most remarkable person I have encountered in a very long life. I intend to spend a considerable portion of whatever time you allow me telling you so." She turned to look at him. In the soft underground garden light, silver and organic and impossible, he was extraordinary. And she was not afraid of him, and she was not afraid of tomorrow, and she was not afraid of loving someone this dangerous and this rare, because 3 years of training, and 8 months of journals, and 1 week in the most ancient court in the world had taught her that the things worth being were almost always the things that scared everyone else. "I'll allow quite a lot of time," she said. "Fair warning." He kissed her forehead, her cheek, the corner of her mouth, and she felt every point of contact like light through a window. The morning of the hearing arrived the way important mornings do, completely ordinary from the outside. Nothing in the quality of the artificial light that filtered through the underground courts to mark it as different, and yet the corridors were different, charged with the accumulated tension of 340 vampires who had been waiting for days to see whether the girl was actually going to manage it. Adeline dressed carefully. She had brought 3 options from the apartment in Vienna she had barely seen in the last week, and she chose the deepest one, midnight blue, structured and precise, which had been her father's favorite color. She wore his watch on her wrist. She carried the original journal pages in a sealed portfolio that she held under her arm with a grip that did not waver. Marius was waiting for her at the entrance to the obsidian court. He was in black, immaculate, sovereign complete, and he looked at her with the silver eyes and the expression she had been cataloguing for a week, and that she now understood was simply what he looked like when he was not performing anything for anyone, when he was just Marius in the particular and unprecedented way that he was Marius only with her. "Ready?" he said. "Completely," she said. They walked into the court together. The hearing was before the full inner council, all 9 members, presided over by Marius in his capacity as sovereign. Seraphian sat at the far end of the council table with 2 legal representatives and the particular expression of a man who believed in contingency plans, which concerned her less than it would have a week ago, because she had built contingencies for his contingencies. The formal proceedings of the obsidian court were ancient and elaborate, and she had studied them until she could have recited them from memory, which meant she lost nothing to unfamiliarity. She presented the evidence methodically, the Luxembourg ledger, the subsidiary instruments, the Harlan Ames documentation, the operational communications, and the final set, the ones dated 48 hours before her father's death, delivered to the council with a steadiness of hand and voice that cost her more than anything else she had done in the hearing room. She watched the council read. She watched Seraphian's face during the reading. He was controlled. He was experienced. He had survived centuries of politics. But there was a quality to the stillness of his face near the end of the operational documents that was the stillness of a man who has understood, finally, that the net is closed. Marius spoke last and briefly, exercising sovereign authority to call for immediate formal charges under the Dragomir Accords, citing the evidence and requesting council vote on the simultaneous renewal and expanded protections of the Arden Compact, which would place the ley line territories under joint human-vampire court oversight for the first time in the Compact's history. The vote was 7-1, Seraphian abstaining because his legal representatives had quietly informed him in the preceding 10 minutes that abstention was the only option that did not constitute additional self-incrimination. The one negative vote was cast by a council member named Draveth Vane, who had been quietly allied with Seraphian for 40 years. and who, 2 hours after the hearing concluded, would be the subject of his own investigation, a thread Adeline had already identified and flagged in a sealed document she had given Marius the previous evening because she was thorough and she believed in doing the work completely. Adeline stood in the center of the obsidian court as the vote was recorded, and the Arden Compact was formally renewed with expanded provisions, and she thought of her father, who had kept the journals and built the record, and died believing the world he was fighting for was worth it. She thought about 35 years of a planted informant and one car accident, and a daughter who had turned grief into preparation and preparation into something that was beginning to look, even to her, like power. She had survived his world, more than survived it. The court was very quiet in the particular way of a room that has just watched something unexpected happen and is recalibrating what it knew. 300 vampires who had watched her walk in alone a week ago and assigned her a life expectancy measured in minutes were now watching her with the variety of attention that meant she was being understood as something they had not previously categorized. She felt Marius's presence at her shoulder before she heard him, and she turned to find him close, silver eyes warm with something that had nothing to do with politics. "How does it feel?" he said quietly. "Like it is not over," she said, "the territory audit. Draveth Vane, the long work of actually building the joint oversight structure." She paused. "And also, like my father's watch is on my wrist, and I am standing in the place he spent 30 years fighting to protect, and it is still here, and so am I." He said nothing but reached out and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face with a deliberateness that was entirely out of character for the sovereign of the oldest court in the world and entirely characteristic of Marius. When no one important was watching, which was to say, now that he had decided that being watched did not change what was true. Behind them, Seraphian was escorted from the chamber by court investigators. He did not look back, which she thought was more revealing than looking back would have been. The next 6 months were the most complex and demanding of Adeline's professional life, and also the most unexpectedly full. She established a formal office within the Arden Compact structure, the first human representative in the Compact's history to hold operational authority rather than purely diplomatic standing, which required 2 separate amendments to the accords that she drafted herself and presented to the full council in arguments so precisely constructed that Cressida Morn later told her they were the finest legal briefs the court archive had received in a century. She worked with Marius on the joint oversight structure for the ley line territories, which was complicated by the fact that the territories in question had 3 separate competing local interests, several of whom had not been formally documented in any court record and had to be identified and brought to the table, which required a combination of archival research, direct negotiation, and 2 separate investigative expeditions to city locations she had not previously known existed. On one of these expeditions, to a converted warehouse in Prague that served as an informal meeting point for an unregistered local court faction, she managed to negotiate a formal recognition agreement between the faction and the inner council in under 4 hours, which the faction's leader, a 400-year-old vampire named Thessaly Grave, told her afterward was the fastest she had ever signed anything since the 17th century, and that she had done so only because the girl had clearly read everything and was not going to be bluffed. "Everyone calls me the girl," Adeline said to Marius in the car on the way back to Vienna. Everyone called you the human heiress when you arrived, he said. They call you something quite different now. What do they call me now? His eyes moved to her briefly with something in them that was warm and specific. Formidable, he said. Some of them say the Arden name again, which has not been used as a title rather than a surname in 30 years. She looked out the window at the dark city moving past. My father would have wanted a different word. What word? Home, she said quietly. I think he wanted to build something that felt like home for both worlds. The car was quiet for a moment. Is this beginning to feel like home? Marius asked, and the question was carrying more weight than its literal surface. She turned from the window to look at him. Yes, she said, it is. The moment in which she understood fully that she was in love with him arrived, as such moments often do, not at a dramatic juncture, but at an entirely ordinary one. It was an evening in November, 4 months after the hearing, and they were in his study as they often were. She working on the latest amendment language for the compact oversight structure, he reviewing council correspondence, both of them occupying the same space with the ease of people who have learned each other's rhythms. She looked up from her work to ask him a question about a specific clause in the original 1683 Accords and found him already looking at her, not with the focused assessor's gaze of their early days, but with something open and unhurried and entirely unguarded. The face of someone who had decided to stop being careful with what they felt. She forgot, staring, she said. I am, he agreed, completely without apology. You look pleased with yourself. I am, he said again. I find I am frequently pleased when I look at you. I have made my peace with this. She put down the document. Marius, Adeline. She crossed the study and sat on the edge of his desk and looked at him in the lamplight. With his white hair and his silver eyes, and 4 centuries of dignity that managed to coexist with the particular expression he wore only in private, which was simply, she had concluded, happiness unusual and somewhat unfamiliar to him but genuine. I need to tell you something, she said. Tell me. I came here to fight for my father's legacy and to protect a compact that 2 generations of my family built. I came prepared for hostility and legal complexity and probable danger. I came with arguments and contingency plans and my father's journals. She held his gaze. I did not come prepared to fall in love with you. He was very still. And yet, she said, here we are. He stood, which brought him very close, and cupped her face in both hands with the careful certainty that she had come to recognize as his particular variety of devotion, the kind that was not performed and not qualified and not contingent on any circumstance. Here we are, he said. He kissed her with the unhurried completeness of someone who intends to continue doing so for a very long time, and she kissed him back with the warmth and specificity of someone who has decided to stop being cautious about what is already absolutely true. They were interrupted by Valdris Nighthollow knocking on the study door with a council briefing that was genuinely urgent, which both of them acknowledged was poor timing, and Adeline went back to her amendment language, and Marius went back to his council correspondence, and nothing had changed except everything, the way nothing changes except everything, when something that has been building finally arrives. Seraphian Voss was formally tried before the Inner Council in January. The charges were extensive, and the evidence was complete, and the outcome, as Cressida Morn told Adeline before the proceedings began, was not in question. He was stripped of his court standing, his territorial holdings placed under court receivership, and sent into monitored exile under the terms of the ancient Dragomir banishment provision. A consequence he could not appeal because the provision predated every layer of his political infrastructure. He looked at Adeline once as he was escorted from the chamber, and she met his gaze steadily, and whatever he saw in her eyes made him look away first. Dravath Vane had already resigned from the Inner Council and entered into a negotiated cooperation agreement with the court investigators in exchange for reduced censure, which Adeline had anticipated and had. In the document she gave Marius, the evening before the hearing 5 months ago, outlined as the most likely secondary outcome. Marius had read that document the morning after the hearing, and his expression when he emerged from his study had been, "She was told by Cressida," the particular look he wore when he encountered something genuinely rare. She was in the underground garden when the formal proceedings concluded, because she needed air that was not the air of a room where final things were happening, even when they were the right final things. The white roses were blooming again, which the gardener, a human employee who had worked for the court for 20 years and regarded Adeline now as an employer rather than a curiosity, had told her was unusual for January, but consistent with the particular ecosystem of the underground space. She heard Marius before she saw him, and did not turn immediately, just registered his presence with the whole-body certainty that she had when he was close, and waited. He sat beside her and said, "It is done." "I know," she said. "He will not threaten you again. He will not threaten the compact again. The territories are in receivership, and the oversight structure is operational." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. The white roses moved slightly in the ventilation current. "Your father's legacy is intact," he said. "More than intact. What you have built in the last 5 months goes beyond anything the compact has achieved in 3 generations. What we have built," she said quietly. His hand covered hers. "What we have built," he agreed. She turned to look at him in the garden light, and he was extraordinary and hers, and no longer a terrifying sovereign to be survived, but a person she knew genuinely and completely, in the particular way that only happens between 2 people who have been through something real together. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what comes next. Tell me." The joint oversight structure needs a permanent human directorate. Someone who understands both worlds, who has standing in the court and standing in the human diplomatic community, who can operate as a genuine bridge rather than a symbolic one. She held his gaze. "I want to build it, not as a temporary representative or a compact heir fulfilling an obligation, but as a real institution, something my father dreamed of and never had the chance to create." "You would stay," he said. "I would stay," she confirmed, "if you wanted me to." The silver eyes were completely transparent, which she had learnt was what happened when he was feeling something too complete to be managed. "I would want nothing else," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. In the garden they had begun to think of as the place where they were most themselves, among the white roses and the impossible January light, and felt the particular and unrepeatable feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be. "We will need to be careful," she said, because she was her father's daughter, and the practical was as important as the emotional. "The court will watch. There will be those who consider a human directorate an overreach. There will be politics. There will always be politics," he said, with the calm certainty of someone who had been navigating them for 4 centuries. "We are considerably better at politics than most of those who will object." She smiled. "That is true, and you have demonstrated to the satisfaction of this court and most of the extended network of courts that watch it, that you are not a human who requires protection from this world." He pressed his lips to her hair. "You are a human who has made herself indispensable to it." "Everyone doubted it," she said. "Everyone was wrong," he said. "Which is their tradition and not yours." In the spring, the joint directorate of the Arden Dragomir Compact was formally established, the first institution in the court's history to bear a human family name alongside the sovereign line, a detail that Authorin Pale, the meticulous registry official, noted in the court record with the dry precision of someone who had been waiting to record something genuinely unprecedented for 300 years. Adeline's office was adjacent to Marius's, which had been the practical arrangement since November and was now simply the formal one, and she spent her days in the serious and satisfying work of building something that mattered. She hired a small team, 2 humans and 1 vampire, the first integrated professional staff in court history, chosen for their competence and their willingness to operate in unfamiliar territory, which she considered the fundamental qualification for the work she was creating. She traveled to 12 territories in 4 months, establishing relationships with local courts and human government bodies and the unofficial networks that sat between them, and she brought back agreements and documentation, and in 2 cases entirely new categories of diplomatic standing that required her to draft new compact provisions from scratch. She was called the most formidable mortal in the court's active history by Cressida Morn, in accounts that was not a compliment so much as a statement of observed fact, which Adeline preferred. She was called the human who changed the world by a young archivist who was 23 and had grown up knowing that the court existed, but not believing it possible to work within it, who came to the directorate's open application process because Adeline had specifically published the vacancy in 3 human diplomatic networks as well as the court registry, which was itself unprecedented. She hired him. He was excellent. On a warm evening in June, 8 months after the hearing that had changed everything, Marius found her in the underground garden at sunset, which was the time she preferred, because the underground garden's artificial light shifted at that hour to something gold and low and irreproducible. And he was carrying, she noticed, 2 glasses of something she recognized as the extraordinarily rare vintage he kept for occasions he considered worth marking. "What are we marking?" she said. "Several things," he said, sitting beside her with the easy familiarity of a man who had long since stopped finding her proximity surprising and begun finding it essential. He handed her one of the glasses. The completion of the 12th Territory Agreement, which the Council reviewed today and approved unanimously, including Dravith Vane's replacement, who is considerable more reasonable. "That is worth marking," she agreed. "Also," he said, and his voice had shifted into the register it took when he was saying something important, lower and more direct. "The fact that it has been 8 months since you walked into this court and refused to be removed from it." His eyes were on hers. "The fact that I have spent those 8 months understanding, with increasing clarity, that the life I was living before you walked in was considerably less than what a life could be." She was quiet. "And also," he continued, with the precision of a man who had been thinking about how to say something for some time, "the fact that I intend, if you will allow it, to spend the rest of your life beside you, in whatever capacity and form that takes, and that I want you to understand this is not a political arrangement or a practical decision or a consequence of sovereign hospitality. The silver eyes were absolutely clear. "It is because I love you," in a fashion I had not previously experienced and cannot now imagine managing without. The garden was very still. "Marius," she said softly. "You are allowed to say it is complicated," he said. "You are allowed to enumerate the practical considerations, of which there are several. I have a list of objections I prepared in advance, if you want to use them." She took the glass from him and set it down on the stone bench beside her and took his face in her hands, which was something she had discovered she loved to do because it made him go entirely still in the way of someone receiving something they were not yet accustomed to receiving, and she looked at him in the gold evening light of a garden under the city. "I love you," she said. "I have been in love with you since the night in your study when you handed me archive access without making me argue for it, which is a very specific and probably ridiculous thing to have fallen in love over. But I am who I am." The expression that moved across his face was extraordinary, full and unmanaged and genuinely, visibly happy. "It is not ridiculous," he said. "It was the first time I gave you what you needed without requiring you to prove the need." "Yes," she said, "exactly that." He kissed her in the underground garden among the white roses in the gold evening light, and it was nothing like the first time and everything like it. And she thought of her father who had kept the journals and protected the compact and believed in a world where both kinds of people could find their way to each other. And she thought that he had been right about more than he knew. The world he had fought for was real. She was living in it in September. Adeline Arden stood before the full court as the human director of the joint Arden-Dragomir Compact and delivered an address that the court archive would preserve and Authryn Pale would later describe as the most significant diplomatic statement made to the Obsidian Court in a century and a half, outlining the framework for a formal treaty between the court and the human international diplomatic community that would create, for the first time in documented history, an official acknowledgement of the compact's existence and authority by both parties. The vote to ratify the framework was unanimous. Afterward, in the corridor outside the court chamber, Cressida Morn stopped her and regarded her with the measuring expression she had worn at their first meeting all those months ago when she had said, "You found this in 3 days." "I told Marius," Cressida said, "when you first arrived, that the girl was either going to change everything or be destroyed trying." "That is comforting," Adeline said. "I was wrong about the second possibility," Cressida said, which, from Cressida Morn, was very nearly the warmest thing she knew how to say. She moved away down the corridor without waiting for a response, which was also entirely characteristic. Marius was waiting at the end of the corridor, and she walked to him through the quiet stone passage that she had learned as intimately as her own apartment above the city, and he folded her into him with the arms around her certainty that still, 8 months in, made her feel like the world had settled into its right arrangement. "The framework passed," she said into his shoulder. "I know," he said. "I was there. My father spent 20 years trying to build the foundation for something like that, and never managed to get the vote." "Your father was building the foundation," Marius said. "You built the house." She pulled back to look at him. He was looking at her with everything he felt about her visible in his face, the silver eyes warm and certain and entirely unhidden. "What comes next?" she said. "More work," he said, which she loved about him, the complete absence of pretense. "More territories. More negotiations. Probably 2 or 3 genuine crises of the kind that require both of us in the same room doing 3 things simultaneously. And between crises, he smiled, which was still rare enough to be remarkable, and was therefore every time extraordinary. Between crises, he said, we live. She took his hand, and they walked together through the quiet corridors of the oldest court in the world, a vampire sovereign and a human woman who had refused to be removed from his world, and who had found in the refusing something she had not planned on finding, something that was hers and his, and genuinely theirs in the specific and irreplaceable way that only belongs to 2 people who have built something together from the material of danger and trust and unexpected love. The compact would hold. The treaty would be signed. The white roses in the underground garden would continue to bloom in January when they had no business blooming. As though the ecosystem itself had decided, something had changed and adjusted accordingly. And Adeline Arden, the human heiress whom everyone had doubted could survive his world, had not merely survived it. She had become the most powerful mortal in it, and she had done it in the only way that mattered, not by becoming something other than human, not by abandoning the warmth and the grief and the capacity for love that made mortality what it was, but by bringing all of those things fully and without apology into a world that had forgotten what they were worth, and showing it. Her father had been right. The world he believed in was possible. It was this one.